CTBK is more than just a full-service accounting firm. They are one team with an innovative approach to accounting and rise to each new challenge with collaborative problem-solving skills. CTBK goes above and beyond by lending helping hands in the Buffalo and Niagara community through volunteer work and donations, and is partnered up with Victory Sports for 2020 and 2021 to keep kids in the community active. The professionals at CTBK are determined to help individuals and businesses succeed. Whether a large corporation, a small business, or somewhere in between, call CTBK at 716-630-2400. Again, 716-630-2400, and see what CTBK's one-team approach can do for you.
Welcome to another edition of Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. I'm Tim Graham of The Athletic, here with my co-host Jonah Bronstein of Bronstein Sports Plus, and welcome to all the new subscribers out there to TGAF. Grateful for you that you caught the podcast last week. It blew up a little bit with the anecdote that I shared regarding Stefon Diggs and Josh Allen after the week 1 loss to the New York Jets. Kind of buried in the podcast, but people picked up on it. It splashed a little bit nationally, and the aggregators picked it up. And thankfully for the podcast, a bunch of new people came into contact with us. We are out there and exposed a little bit more, and I want to thank you for joining us. Hopefully we don't disappoint you with the follow-up episode and you realize, why the hell did I subscribe to this? But we do have some stuff to get to regarding the Bills and the Buffalo Sabres. We're going to be joined later in the podcast by Travis Yost of TSN. We're going to talk some Sabres, of course, with them being officially eliminated from the playoff hunt. And it never really seemed like it was going to come to fruition. It always seemed kind of like kind of a lark, Jonah, that the Sabres were flirting with the playoffs for the past month. But let's start with Stefon Diggs. I know that there are a lot of folks who, as I said, came to the podcast last week because of Stefon Diggs. So it's something that people want to listen to. They want to hear about. And there's been additional drama just in the past few days, and a lot of people reading in between the lines, trying to come up with reasons why Stefon Diggs had a falling out with the Bills. We're seeing a narrative out there on social media, or at least I did today. It seems like it's been out there for a bit, of people saying he was maybe upset that he didn't get good offseason workouts out of Josh Allen. And I was able to respond to some of that by saying they did work out last offseason. Stefon Diggs wasn't necessarily a part of it, but Josh Allen got all the receivers together. They did it as they always have. They just didn't have cameras around like they did 2-3 years ago. But they did do those offseason workouts. So we can put that criticism to rest. We had Stefon Diggs taking a shot at Bills fans, seemingly. I'll try to post this on the podcast, but yesterday, Stefon Diggs has a rest in peace Vontae Davis. Apparently, he doesn't specify, but I'm guessing it's Vontae Davis. They didn't play together, but they're from the same region. They're from the Maryland, D.C. area. Perhaps they know each other. Perhaps they cross paths. Their families might know each other. And underneath Stefon Diggs's tweet, in which he's saying rest in peace to a friend, or at least an NFL brother, just a stream of pretty much people telling him to go F himself. And so somebody tweets, Bills low-key got the worst fan base, y'all bitter as F in the comments. And Stefon Diggs liked it. And so now people are doubly upset at Stefon Diggs for now seeming to co-sign the idea that the Bills low-key got the worst fan base. But based on the responses to the man just saying rest in peace, holy smokes, I think I agree with Stefon Diggs on this one. Anyways, Jonah, a lot of Stefan Diggs talk out there still, and I think we're going to be talking about him for months to come. Bills fans trying to wrap their heads around one of their favorite players now turning heel and going down to Houston and having workouts already and trying to show that he's the ultimate team player with CJ Stroud. And I'm not exactly sure who was all part of it, if Tank Dell and Nico Collins were, but they're all getting together. Something that he would not be doing if he were still a member of the Buffalo Bills this offseason, because he infamously did not take part in the voluntary stuff. I don't know, Jonah. We've had more days to digest this. Where are you with Stefan Diggs?
Well, as far as the like tweet, I mean, I do think there's maybe a grain of truth to the underbelly of the Bills fan base, and maybe that's not unique to the other 30, 31 fan bases in the NFL, but the one that we're most familiar with. There is some ugly stuff, especially online, but the Bills fans turned very quickly on Stefan Diggs, which could be expected. But as soon as he was traded, you heard a lot of the criticism and the wishing he was embracing his departure. And I think that probably did hurt a player like Stefan Diggs' feelings. At the same time, it's a bit of another microaggression to actually like that tweet on a social media site where that becomes public. I mean, it's for somebody like Stefan Diggs, if you're liking a tweet, that's almost like sending a tweet. You're showing the way you feel about something. And even if he does agree with that, that was a choice to like that tweet and kind of put that out into the world that he endorsed that opinion. Although I don't really blame him maybe for, some of the heat he's had to take from Bills fans over the past week online. And then for doing that on a tweet about, a friend of his, we presume, that died recently, that's poor form to do that. I would come back to pretty much the same thing I said a week ago, is that, I think we're going to miss Stefan Diggs, the character, maybe more so than the football player, and the content that derives from that, and the interest and the intrigue, and even now the villain nature that he's taken on with the Bills fan base. And I guess that's not over with, because he's still in the league, and the Bills do play a game at Houston this year, and that'll be a lot of hype going into that game about playing against Stefan Diggs. And Stefan Diggs now is this, anti-Buffalo character. And the fact that, this podcast, we've had a number of episodes over the past year where we were just going to briefly touch on the Stefan Diggs situation, and we ended up going 30, 40 minutes about all the tentacles that go on. It's just a very interesting player and persona and dynamic to talk about and analyze and break down. And every 2, 3, 4 weeks, he gave us a new episode to unpack. And this is just the latest. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised that we got a little bit of viral response to this podcast. Although, as you mentioned, it was kind of a quick throwaway line. We didn't plan to necessarily talk about those details. And the fact that got picked up just reflects how much the NFL community, now outside of Buffalo, but really all NFL fans, are interested in Stefan Diggs and Josh Allen, and whether the drama that they had or didn't have, and analyzing that. And people were very interested in an anecdote from a game that happened, I don't know, 6, 8 months ago. And even if it did show something about Stefan Diggs and Josh Allen's relationship, there were a lot of games and a lot of weeks and a lot of time that passed since then. And still people are very interested in what happened after that game, and maybe why, as you reported, Josh Allen had a short temper with Stefan Diggs' post-game remarks.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up the story quick because I'm going to make a point about it.
And as you noted on the podcast, you don't know what Stefan Diggs said. He might have said something encouraging. We don't really know. He might have said something highly appropriate. Remember, Josh Allen did pretty much throw the game away there. He had some bad decisions throwing the ball deep and some interceptions. And even though he didn't play great in every single game of the season going forward, that was probably Josh Allen's worst game in terms of what he did to help the Bills win. And, we don't know what Stefan Diggs said, but that was, if you put yourself back in the context of that game, I don't think it was all that out of line maybe for Stefan Diggs to have something to say to his quarterback. And another thing is, you got to remember at that time, you remember, but maybe to give it some context, we had gone through that whole offseason and then a preseason of Stefan Diggs and Josh Allen, and whether they were getting along, whether Stefan Diggs still really wanted to be a Bill. And we had come out of a preseason where there was a lot of sentiment that was overblown and that Stefan Diggs was happy in Buffalo. And he was even talking to the media again, which he hadn't done throughout the offseason for much of the preseason. And, you can kind of get into the comments from Pro Football Talk, but I think that's important context to know that we were all in a mode there where it seemed like the Stefan Diggs, Josh Allen story had been put on the back burner or put to bed. And, if anybody else saw that, I think they might have had the same reaction, that you didn't really want to overreact to one thing that you overheard in the locker room, because there was a lot baked into the context of that game and that story and that teammate dynamic at the time.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. I thought about tweeting. I thought about reaching out to Mike Florio directly. I chose not to because he didn't reach out to me, so I'm not going to give him the same courtesy. I mean, this is a guy who aggregates for a living. His whole media empire is built on taking other people's work, turning it into a headline, and getting people to click on it. But essentially, on one of his videos at PFT Live, he and Chris Sims called me a liar. Not only did they call me a liar, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, kind of. I mean, you listen to the clip, but they said they rejected my premise and my explanation for why I didn't use the Stefan Diggs, Josh Allen anecdote in my story. They said that I did it because it was a business decision and I needed it for access. I'm paraphrasing, but that you don't bring that up. He's putting himself in the role of a journalist by saying you don't bring that up because you don't want to upset the organization or the dynamic, and you need to get your quotes and your access. To which I say, go fuck yourself. The headline on that column was a rip job on Josh Allen. Now, if I'm trying to make business decisions, me of all people make business decisions, the guy whose headline about the toxic work environment of the Pagula organization, who's talking to sources about this, that, and the other. I mean, if I'm going to make a business decision, am I going to write that Josh Allen was absent, that this guy who said he was going to be as focused and locked in on football like never before? I'll read what I wrote. This is the lead to that story. Dateline, East Rutherford, New Jersey. When the Buffalo Bills reported for off-season workouts 7 months ago, Josh Allen declared he'd, quote, never been as focused or locked in, end quote, on football. Now, I'm not saying Allen was being disingenuous, and I'm not accusing him of being too distracted, and I certainly won't fault him for enjoying his celebrity. But the superstar quarterback had been all over the place this summer, just like his passes were all over the place Monday night. Allen produced one of the worst games of his life. A mediocre performance would have been enough to beat the New York Jets in MetLife Stadium, but Allen threw 3 interceptions, lost a fumble, and was sacked 5 times in a 22-16 overtime loss. So, look, and then I rolled all this out about how I said he said he was focused like never before. Back to my story. Yet it wasn't long after Allen asserted that commitment to recalibrate, we realized he was doing more non-football work than ever. He's the Madden NFL 24 cover boy. He seems to appear in every third commercial during football games. He endorses Pepsi and Gillette and Frito-Lay and Verizon and Wester Auto Group. He has deals with Nike, New Era, Encore golf balls, and who knows what else. Photos of him and actress Haley Steinfeld have splashed the entertainment and gossip pages. He attended all 4 golf majors and the Kentucky Derby. He's involved with Major League Pickleball. And yet I'm picking my spots because I need to make a business decision as to who I am friendly with within the organization.
If I could just say here, that's not your style to pull punches like that. In fact, you're a little bit maybe quick to drop the gloves and get involved quicker than others. And as we'll talk about later, the situation with the Sabres sitting at their locker earlier this season. I mean, you'll come to a Sabres game having not been there all year and stir the pot. I would have never think. I know there's other reporters that might think that way, but I think that you would not think twice about whether your access would be disturbed by including that anecdote in your column.
I didn't include it and I've had time to think about it. The basic reason was I didn't hear what Stefan Diggs said to Josh Allen. I heard what everybody else said to Josh Allen. Whatever Stefan Diggs said to him, I couldn't make it out. So I didn't include it. I don't know what he said to set him off. And it was brief. It was a burst. It was just a little outburst. And then everything was back to quiet, back to solemn. Everybody walking on eggshells around Josh, giving him, like I said, the dapping and the pat on the back, the fist bumps, whatever. And I included that halfway into my story. It wasn't even the lead to my story. It was a pretty minor, well, it wasn't minor. In retrospect, it wasn't minor. Things gain context over time. But I also want to point out, I'm here defending myself. I'm the only Buffalo journalist, I think, or Western New York, who covers the team, that mentioned the infamous "it's not because of me" part of Stefan Diggs's press conference late in the season, in which he was saying, "What's going on with you? What's your production?" There are journalists in Buffalo who cover the team who omitted that sentence, and that sentence only. Now, you want to talk about making a business decision, taking a quote out just so you don't have to deal with the fallout of people pushing back, apparently, because it sure was there. It wasn't in the transcript that everybody types up who covers the team, and it wasn't in certain coverage. But when I listened to the news conference myself, I heard him say, "It's not because of me." And I put it in the friggin' headline. So you want to talk about making a business decision about upsetting the Bills or upsetting Stefan Diggs? I'm also the guy who wanted to ask the follow-up question and got cut off of Sean McDermott. I tried to ask a Stefan Diggs follow-up question, and I tweeted about it. You don't think that upset people in the public relations department or Sean McDermott or anybody else, in which Pro Football Talk made mention of it? Mike Florio doesn't even know what he uses of mine and doesn't. But he's going to look back on it and say that I made a business decision. Well, screw him. I mean, I did what I did. It was a journalistic decision. I thought it was ethical, not knowing both sides of the subject. Perhaps I could have gone up to Stefan Diggs and say, "Hey, man, what'd you say to him?" It was a piece of half-baked gossip that now everybody has latched onto, and I mentioned it, and it's still half-baked gossip. We still don't know what Stefan Diggs said to him. So anyways, that's my pushback on essentially being called a liar by Mike Florio and Chris Sims for how I handled what to cover or not to cover in a locker room. And by the way, the locker room was full of people. It was a Monday Night Football game in the New York market. There were reporters galore in that locker room. So I guess we all made a business decision, including the New York media who's ever there. Probably, usually it's the more junior reporter who's in the opposing locker room. He wouldn't be looking for a big scoop to pass along for the New York Post or the New York Daily News or anybody. I happened to see it. I made note of it. And when I wrote the story, I didn't include it. Simple as that. And it had nothing to do with me trying to preserve a relationship with Stefan Diggs or the Buffalo Bills PR department or Josh Allen or anybody else, because I think my coverage illustrates that it wouldn't fall in line with the rest of it. Why I would choose to keep that out and nothing else? Well, I don't know. Maybe Mike Florio has another conspiracy theory, and he can teach the world journalism ethics and put words in my mouth. He could have had me on. I would have been more than willing to join his podcast and talk to he and Chris Sims about it. But the guy was yelling into the microphone that not that I made up the anecdote. He said he believed the anecdote, but then he just pretty much shit all over my journalistic approach. So he can get bent.
I think I'd like to note here, and maybe the aggregators might pick up on this, maybe not. But, the column you referenced a few minutes ago about Stefan Diggs' drop in production and the quote he had that you used and other people don't. After that came out and there was a bit of a reaction to it and a further aggregation of it on Instagram and social media where they just kind of splash the headline and don't.
I think at Pro Football Talk too, for that matter.
Yeah, perhaps. But Stefan Diggs didn't talk to all of us in the media for the next 3 or 4 weeks, however many weeks were remaining in the regular season. And then he went back to his normal press conference routine for the playoffs. And I didn't hear this myself, but it was he said to other reporters it was because he didn't feel protected in that media exchange, and what that meant, and whether it was the questions themselves or the what you wrote or how that was interpreted and aggregated by sites and
yeah, there
social
was
media
a
accounts and
site that
whatnot.
aggregated it and butchered the quote and tried to make it seem even worse than it was. Now, I thought it was interesting. It piqued my interest. I mean, it should, for two reasons. Number one, I thought it was a poignant part of what he said. Maybe that, you know, he's saying, hey, it's not because of me. You know, I'm doing everything the same and whatever. Hey, it's not because of me. I was
But
struck that people purposely omitted that quote in their coverage of that news conference, in which gobs and gobs of quotes were used from that news conference, but that sentence was specifically redacted. And so I made it a point to make sure people knew that he said it. And I put it in the headline because I thought it was poignant, provocative. Sure. What's Stefan Diggs is provocative. And he knows what he's doing. And I think that a lot of fans who have been, I think, willfully ignorant, obtuse regarding his motivations and how he operates are now coming around to that, you know, that this is how he operates. So anyway, I used that in the headline purposely. And I got a lot of blowback from it. People telling me that I'm just stirring the pot. I'm digging, you know, I'm creating a scene where there isn't one, but we all know there was one for those who were willing to acknowledge it. I'm sorry, you were making a point and I just totally derailed you.
Well, I kind of made my point, but that reaction, that not talking to the media for several weeks after what you wrote, and kind of how that spun itself off into the
Oh, I was going to say
NFL
that
ecosystem.
the one site that did aggregate it, it wasn't even a thing to link to. It was just a quote. It was like the type of social media account that tweets things to just generate followers. Oh,
Sure.
wow, I want to follow this. Memes, you know, pull out quotes. Like there was nothing to go click on. It was just, and it mashed together two parts of Stefan Diggs's quote and was totally unethical. And some of that came back on me as, oh, that's the Tim Graham story. Tim Graham's putting words in Stefan Diggs' mouth. I'm like, no, somebody aggregated my story, mashed it together and for followers, and I have no control over that.
But that's a big part of our media world now, especially for audiences that skew younger. Stefan Diggs is a lot more likely to see that Instagram post or that graphic on a social media site than he probably is to have read your column or even be aware of what you wrote in the headline from your column. But I just always thought it was interesting that he had that reaction to what you wrote that seemed to be pretty fair, because it was really just a quote of what he said at an open press conference, and didn't really have that same reaction to anything else that was written about him, any other testy press conferences, exchanges. There were times, especially early on, where Stefan Diggs kind of gave the impression that he didn't care what was written about him, didn't care what people said or thought, that he almost kind of liked the mystery and the intrigue that was being created. But he was sensitive to that. Even the team employee.
And the joust. He liked a little bit of the verbal joust, as long as he had you on your heels.
Yeah, but something about that struck a nerve with him, or whatever made him feel like he wasn't protected. I don't even know what that means, who he thought was there to protect him, or what those protectors could have done to prevent you from writing what you wrote, or from an Instagram account from making a graphic out of it. Even when a team employee was talking very directly about him, he did his press conference that day. We never really knew if he knew about that at the time, but he did his press conference the next week, and he did respond to it on social media, but it never seemed to carry over into his normal media relations. But something about, now I probably baked into that was his downturn in production. And even though he wasn't trying to let on that was bothering him or something he was thinking about, he probably was. But, you know, it was just interesting kind of the way this Stefan Diggs saga ended in a bit of a whimper there, with him not playing very well and also not talking very often, and then into this offseason and eventually the trade out of town.
Do you think he is on the team if he makes that? Let's say he makes that catch against the Chiefs, and yet they don't score the touchdown. Let's say the game ends exactly the same, because they still got close enough to kick the field goal. Tyler Bass missed it, tough conditions, etc. But let's say he makes that catch, and that's not the lasting impression we have in the photo that keeps getting used. Unfortunately for Bills fans, you got people posting a picture of that drop underneath his tweet, RIP Tay. I mean, for crying out loud. But if we don't have that lasting image, is he still on the team?
So I don't know if one play, one catch really would have made the difference, unless if he catches that ball and breaks a tackle and scores a touchdown and wins the game and the Bills go to the Super Bowl. I think if the Bills had more playoff success, he'd be a lot more likely to be here. I don't know if one catch, and especially as you framed it, if he makes the catch, but the Bills still don't win that game, he's not the go to the game anymore, but I still don't think it changes how the Bills and Brandon Beane analyze the situation. But you remember, there were other deep balls that Josh Allen and Stefon Diggs failed to connect on late in the season. And that drop, to me, it seemed quite abnormal because he was a sure-handed receiver for most of his time here, and you usually thought on a lot of those plays that Stefon Diggs was going to make the play. But it did seem to encapsulate his last 2 months in Buffalo, that he wasn't the same player. You couldn't rely on him to make the same plays, whether that's a fair assessment or not. That drop almost seemed like a scene from a sports movie where it really showed everything that happened in those 8 to 10 weeks that you couldn't show in the movie, but that one play kind of showed how the end of Stefon Diggs' time in Buffalo came to be.
Yeah, I think that knowing what I know, and I wrote the column, and the first sentence was Stefon Diggs wore out the Buffalo Bills. He was still wearing them out. Like the whole season had happened, all these things, the strained relationships, the news conferences, Trayvon Diggs's tweets, taking shots at Diggs's teammates and quarterback and organization without Stefon Diggs pushing back. And in fact, Stefon Diggs being offended that anybody would ask why he doesn't push back. It would be interesting, though. It would be, obviously, he would be seen different because that's the big ammo. That's the big ammo that fans have in their ability to say, see you later, deuces, beat it, is that drop. And if he doesn't have that drop, I'm curious what fans think, if they are maybe more pissed off at Brandon Beane for trading this guy, or the organization, or Sean McDermott. Probably is where it would fall. Sean McDermott blew it. We had this great relationship. He couldn't navigate these two alpha males and keep a good thing together. That's probably where it would land. And Sean McDermott, as he told me when we had that sit down interview at the combine, when he once again refused to tell me what happened during 13 seconds, is he believes that his role as the head coach is to be a black hole sometimes. And whether it's to protect people or he's got to do what's best for the organization. And I'm guessing that if the Bills were to have dealt Stefon Diggs and he had a little bit better production and didn't have that picturesque drop, that Sean McDermott's probably just eating it. He's just absorbing all the criticism, and we probably don't get that much more insight. The Bills have actually been pretty good at not, his team. Have we seen anything from Stefon Diggs' teammates? Have we seen thank yous or, man, tough business decision, hate to see my homie go? I mean, I've been on social media a lot the last couple of days, but I traveled over the weekend. I mean, was there any? I'm not asking rhetorically. Have you seen anything
I didn't
from anybody?
see any. Now, I don't follow every player as much as some other people do. So, especially on all of the networks, because somebody could have said something on TikTok or Snapchat that we didn't see on Twitter or whatever. But I didn't see any of that. I think we specifically did not see anything from Josh Allen. And we did see the team kind of put out a thank you, Stefon Diggs tweet. And I'm sure some players share that, but I didn't see much interaction with that or an endorsement of that or, Josh Allen or another key player being involved in the messaging there.
The team has kept its mouth shut, and that they're taking the high road. Although, and we talked about it last week on the podcast, Brandon Beane did make a couple of references He made the one reference saying, hey, how many all pros did he make before he was trying to think off the top of his head, and he knew the answer. It was 0. He was like, I don't remember how many all pros or Pro Bowls he went to before he joined us, but he made that reference. That was some shade. And then he also made a point regarding how trades like this abruptly happen. And he says, usually it's from somebody with an off the field transgression, something serious happens off the field. And he's like, but no, not with Steph. And that was no one thing. And that was his way of saying it was a lot of little things, a lot of those microaggressions. And again, that's me putting words in Brandon Beane's mouth. He was asked that question. That's me, is my job as somebody. I guess I'm Mike Florio in this instance. I'm going to parse. I'm going to go ahead and dissect his words. But there's a difference in that I have been around this organization and these people for a while, and I know some things, as opposed to deciding from several hundred miles away, I'm going to try to get into a reporter's head who I haven't spoken to.
There was also, he did not comment on whether Stefan Diggs or his agent requested the trade. And
he could have. That's a very easy question to say no to.
So it was assumed that he did. And this is just me kind of thinking, speculating, going back in time here now. But I think a lot of us believe that meant that trade request was made recently in this offseason. But that could have been going back over a year. And, there were meetings and sit downs, and there was that mini camp where he showed up and then got sent home. And that could have been hashed out, or at least not decided, but maybe implicated and perhaps decided over a year ago that they would go together for this one season because, financially the Bills could not make a trade a year ago, and that they would get to this offseason and find a way to make that happen this offseason. Now, I don't know that. I'm not reporting that, but I mean, I think that's very possible that, the Bills organization and Stefan Diggs and everybody involved knew before the season or during the season that this would be the offseason outcome. And we were all surprised somewhat. Maybe you saw some of it coming, but it wasn't really leaked. It wasn't really known that it would happen, but maybe within the building, there was more known about it. And I think too, and I don't want to say anything to get myself in trouble, but we've all worked in situations where somebody's been let go and you're kind of forced to be quiet about it or told not to comment on it. And it feels like that. It kind of feels like,
but with a big roster full of former teammates, I think that there are guys, especially former teammates. There's a lot of guys who've just been cut. You're free of the Bills. You could still say what you think about Stefan Diggs, the teammate, and not violate any kind of organizational trust. I mean, and again, maybe they're out there and I haven't seen them, but there are a lot of guys who are no longer with the Bills who played with Stefan Diggs for a long time.
Yeah, well, look, the Bills start their OTAs next week, and I believe Josh Allen will give some sort of press conference and other players, and those Stefan Diggs questions will come, especially to Josh Allen, but probably to every player on the team, at least every offensive player on the team, and some of the key defensive players. And they had to answer a lot of Stefan Diggs questions last offseason and through the season. And most of the responses were, we love Steph. He's a great receiver. But, I don't know, maybe that there's some subtext that wasn't spoken in some of those answers, and maybe we'll get some more honest answers, or maybe we won't. I don't know. Do you think it's appropriate if Josh Allen is asked about Stefan Diggs next week and he declines to elaborate or talk about the subject?
Is it appropriate? Well, yeah. I mean, you want him to say it, but you know me, Jonah. We've had this, journalistic, philosophical discussion all the time. I've mentioned it here. I never feel like I'm owed anything. There are some reporters who would, if they could, kick open the locker room door and, and demand answers, with a flashlight, right in the eyes of the player they're interviewing. If Josh Allen doesn't want to talk about it, I mean, he's open for criticism, but I don't think he has to. And it's probably smart for him not to, take the high road, say as little as possible. However, sometimes you just want to get it off your chest and you feel liberated. Maybe he does. I mean, but it's one of those deals where, especially where we've seen how things have gone here over the last few days, how fans are feeling about it, how Stefan Diggs is feeling about the fans based on his social media. Stefan Diggs is all of a sudden try hard receiver all over again, like he was when he was younger, getting the Texans together for workouts that, to reiterate, there's no way he would have been doing with the Bills if he were still a member of the team. There's all kinds of the image buildup that he's working on right now. I wonder if it's going to be hard for fans to believe any nice things that are said, right? I mean, I'm not saying that they're lying, of course, but anybody who says something nice, the fans are going to say, well, that's what they're supposed to say. And they're because it's going to be hard for them to believe that, because he's turned heel. He's totally turned heel, and he was probably a heel, or at least partial heel, all along, but everything was kind of insulated. And, I know I've mentioned it a bunch, playing catch with the fans and his M&T commercials and his things that he would do when the cameras were on. His last words to the Buffalo media were after that game against the Chiefs. And I think a couple of people might have approached him after Matthew Fairburn did, but was, hey, do you have a couple of minutes to talk? And his response was, hell nah. So that was his farewell to the Buffalo media, and I think to fans by proxy, to explain or to say anything about what happened against the Chiefs and why he dropped the ball and what happened and what do you think about your future, and hell nah. No.
Well, a lot of this seems to be tracking to a player and a team that knew they were parting ways before the season ended. And even what you wrote and how you quoted RG3 saying the Bills seemed to be trying to prove that they could win without Stefon Diggs. Maybe it was because they knew, or I don't know if that was
Devin McCourty.
Devin McCourty, sorry.
Devin McCourty.
Maybe because they knew that day was coming soon, and in their midseason offensive crisis, they probably, or in this scenario, recognize that they need to play better offense in the present, and then they need to figure out a way to play offense without Stefon Diggs in the future, and they might as well get cracking on that sooner or later. I'm making some assumptions here, but the more we kind of go back and think about and retell these anecdotes, it does seem to track towards a player and a team and a situation that knew that this was their last dance together, and a lot of the behaviors stemmed from that.
Yeah, and some of it comes from, just reading the tea leaves, and that's a combination of me with my experience, and also I'm around and I have sources. And so I it's funny, the pushback that I do get sometimes, and I'm not doing a pity thing. I'm actually gloating a little bit, but I was letting you know that I was getting the vibe that Stefan Diggs was wearing out his welcome. I even said addition by subtraction. Heading into the Super Bowl, he did that interview with Kay Adams in which he called himself a pro's pro, and really was laying it on thick. And I tweeted out with the link to that, it's getting to the point of addition by subtraction. And that's coming from experience. It's also coming from the fact that I talked to people. Now, were they telling me he's gone? Absolutely not. But that's where some institutional knowledge and some experience can go a ways. It's where, people telling me I'm wrong when I say DeAndre Hopkins isn't coming. People are going to tell me I'm wrong about this and that. I mean, generally, I'm usually right. I'm not always right, and when I'm wrong, I mean, hell, I'm not a hot take guy. I don't go out on a limb much. I guess it's just my way of saying, hey, maybe pay attention a little bit. Don't just dismiss it because it's inconvenient. I know you wanted DeAndre Hopkins last year. I know fans really wanted him, but when I'm telling you he's not coming, you probably should believe it.
Speaking of hot take artists, what do we think now in retrospect about Stephen A. Smith? And I think this is maybe why I had RG3 on the brain. But at various points early and through the season, they were pretty firm in speculating / reporting that, they had people tell them or heard through the grapevine that Stefan Diggs was unhappy in Buffalo and wanted out. And now, as we see, Stefan Diggs is out and there was a degree of unhappiness. Do we think maybe those reports were a little bit more on the nose at the time than they seemed?
Yeah, well, I'm never dismissive of that. Now, yeah, you're right. Stephen A. Smith is a hot take artist, but when he starts quoting sources, even anonymously, when he cites sources, I believe him that he has sources. It's one thing to do, hot takery, off of the headlines. But when the guy says he's got sources telling him X, Y, Z, I don't dismiss that. I don't think he's making it up. I mean, there's kind of a belief that those guys do just say things for effect. But if you're going to go to the point of saying, I know people, then, Stephen A. Smith knows a lot of people. He knows a lot of people who are in the know. So, no, I kind of took it as there's something there. Was I hearing anything that emphatic? No. I mean, I could go back and in retrospect and say, I saw this coming. The classic as expected reply when some news breaks that a lot of people do on social media in our profession. As expected, or I'd been hearing this for weeks, because it's just to kind of take a shot at the person who broke the story. Like, it's not that big of a scoop. I knew it was coming. No, I didn't know it was coming. I had a feeling that it could, whereas a lot of people viewed it as no possible way. The contract prohibits the Bills from moving on from this guy. I never viewed it that way. And so I also took what Stephen A. Smith said at face value, which to me is, I give it a lot of value coming from him. Another thing I wrote to shift topics happened last night. I wrote back in December when I was covering the Sabres for Matthew Fairburn, who was out on paternity leave. I came into a situation in which the Sabres were floundering, and they lost to the Columbus Blue Jackets 1-0 or whatever the score was. And I walked into the locker room thinking I'd see a little bit more accountability. Well, I'm laying it on, a lot more accountability. Walked into the locker room and saw very few people at their stalls. Usually after games like that, a coach or a captain will say, everybody sit at their locker stall and you're going to have a bite of this shit sandwich that we're about to face from the media. And Kyle Oposo stood there and he answered all the questions, as difficult as they were. I remember Casey Middlestat was in there and a couple other players, Greenway perhaps. No defensemen were in there. And I wrote about it. And I asked Don Granato about it in his post-game news conference. And he was like, well, if you need anybody to be interviewed, just ask our PR staff. And I'm like, that's not the point. This is like a hockey thing. And I came to find out that I guess I'm a little old fashioned. I reached out to Scotty Bowman. I reached out to some former players that I used to cover, guys who are in front offices now. And I was like, am I all washed up here? Are things so different? And they pretty much said, teams don't do that much anymore. They used to, but they don't do it. The whole idea of everybody at their locker stall happened, I don't know, 3 or 4 times while I was covering the Sabres for the 7 years that I covered them. 6 seasons, because one of them was a lockout year in which there was no hockey. And then I talked to a bunch of other reporters. Man, I haven't seen that in a while, they were telling me. Our Chicago Blackhawks writer said that Jonathan Taves had done it. That was the most recent example that I could find while canvassing the Athletic hockey writers for, hey, man, does anybody do this anymore? Vancouver had done it, but it had been maybe 10 years. John Tortorella's Philadelphia Flyers did it last night, and it took people by surprise. There are some younger hockey reporters who were like, I've never seen this or even heard of this before. No, it's happened, and it used to happen quite a bit. It was common when you've shit the bed and everybody needs to sit down and at least be available for a couple minutes. Now, if the reporters don't come to you, then you can get up and go back into the second locker room that almost every hockey team has, where the guys actually get dressed and have their stuff. And then there's the locker room for show that they hang out in, that the media is allowed in. anyways, I thought it was interesting that John Tortorella, a coach that a lot of people wish was working with the Sabres, did it with the Flyers as their season is in a bit of a nosedive. And their general manager, Daniel Briere, who used to be a part of those types of things back when I was covering the team. Interesting that the Flyers played that card from the olden days, apparently.
Well, John Tortorella is a bit old-fashioned himself, and when he was an assistant here in Buffalo, him and John Muckler fought with fans in the stands after one game, and
Matthew
got
Fairburn
suspended
did a
for
great
that.
story just last week or the week before about John Tortorella's time coming up as a new coach through the Rochester Americans, and then as an assistant with the Sabres. That's how he got his start.
Yeah, and then it was about a week or so ago. I'm not sure what game it was. I think it was the game before they came to Buffalo. John Tortorella had ripped his team and their effort in the second period publicly in the media in a way that Don Granato never does, and that Sabres fans have maybe been wanting to hear from a Sabres coach and haven't really heard it from any Sabres coach in a long time, probably since Lindy Ruff. There were some slight criticisms from Phil Housley, or no, Dan Bylsma against Jack Eichel early in his career, and some people believe that was why Dan Bylsma wasn't retained as the coach after his second season, because of comments he made about Jack Eichel in press conferences. But back to John Tortorella, so then they come and play in Buffalo, and I skipped Don Granato's press conference to kind of hear what John Tortorella said, because they had just lost pretty bad to the Sabres, and I thought he might have some feisty things to say, and he didn't. He was very complimentary of his team for having the shooting advantage and just getting beat by Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and a better goaltender that night. The interesting thing with the Flyers is John Tortorella has had this kind of old style coaching style with them this season, and it's led to an improvement for them from last season, and they're ahead of the Sabres in the standings and playing above 500 hockey. But they've lost 8 in a row now, and we'll see what happens from this. Everybody sitting at your locker stall and taking your medicine from the media that happened last night before their final 3 games, and whether they make a playoff push here. But the buttons he's been pushing haven't worked of late, and I don't know if that means that what he's doing is something wrong, or if it's just a young team that, like the Sabres, are one of the 10 youngest teams in the league. If they're just kind of having their natural progression towards swooning at the end of the season, and regardless of what John Tortorella says or does, they're going to keep losing hockey games, or if this turns the team around. And it's an obvious storyline. If they do happen to win these next 3 games and make the playoffs, that something like that had an effect. I just wonder whether it's the Sabres or the Flyers or really any team in pro sports now, if there is something generational about players not really responding to being called out publicly in different ways. I think you see that with younger coworkers, students we teach. It seems to have just changed culturally in and out of sports to where people don't respond in the same way that maybe a previous generation did to that kind of public criticism.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, the guys and the younger players have more power. I mean, with the collective bargaining agreement the way it is, and I think that's great for labor, and it's the way it should be. They have way more freedom in terms of getting out of their contracts or leaving an organization earlier. It used to be you were drafted into an organization and you were their property for a long time, with all the different restricted free agencies and qualifying offers and all the different things that teams could do to keep retaining your services until you got to a certain age. And now it's much younger. For the record, the Flyers, with 3 games to go, are 36, 32, and 11. That's 83 points. They are 2 points behind the Capitals, although the Capitals have a game in hand, and they are 1 point behind both the Penguins and the Red Wings, who also have a game in hand. So not looking good for the Flyers at all. And it's a desperation move, of course. I mean, people are probably thinking they wished Tortorella would have done this 2 weeks ago. But he's in a desperation mode. Does he come back? What do the Flyers do with him? I don't know, but interesting to see what's happening there. We're going to talk more about the Sabres with Travis Yost coming up after the break. But Jonah, while you're here, what your thoughts on them being mathematically eliminated? Anything come to mind or perspective now that it's official that maybe we didn't think?
I mean, I don't think there's
last
any
week.
surprise that they're not making the playoffs. We've seen this from the very early stages of the season. The surprise comes from preseason and going into the year, where many of us were led to believe that this team would take another step, even though they're still the youngest team in the league and even younger than they were a year ago by average age. They are maybe more experienced in certain places, and the key players had another year under their belts and thought this team would take another step, and instead it plateaued. The Sabres did have a better second half of the season than they did in the first half, which should be somewhat encouraging. I think the biggest surprise was maybe how they won a few games down the stretch and held on and extended their, last gasp playoff push a week or so beyond maybe where it seemed like it would be a month or two ago. But a lot of that is because other teams are losing, and the bar to get into the playoffs seems like it might be a little bit lower this year than it was a year ago. I mean, the Sabres were eliminated in game 79 this year and game 80 last year. But even if they win all these remaining games, they're going to have 6 fewer points. So it was easier to make the playoffs this year, and the Sabres were still not up to the task. It's now 13 years. I don't know if there's anything surprising about it, because people really I think, have gotten used to it. And the surprising thing would be if the Sabres do pull through and become a playoff team. Not that it's surprising that they could do it, but that it'll be so foreign to many people that follow the team, and a lot of us who covered the team who don't go back as far as you did and didn't cover the team when they were in the playoffs and a winning program over a decade ago.
Yeah, it is interesting to see a team that is just treading water, even though they figured out a couple of things. They found their goaltender. And I know that we can go back to the beginning of the season in which UPL was the third goalie and how they mismanaged that. But even finding a goaltender and having him play top 5 in the league from January 1st on, and they still weren't able to close the gap enough. Interesting. Also another Matthew Fairburn piece in which, and I hadn't realized this, but the Sabres got within 4 points 6 times this season, and they went 0-6 in those games. And a team that's not ready to handle the pressure, apparently. And yes, they could close the gap and do some things when the pressure was off, because the season was virtually over. But then when they would get close again and they'd wilt. So that's it's fascinating. And what's going to happen in the off season? Are Kevin Adams and Don Granato going to be back? Boy, I don't know. I think that if Kevin Adams has his druthers, Don Granato is back. But Terry Pegula can make him fire Don Granato, or Terry Pegula could get rid of them both. The money that they're saving on Stefan Diggs' base salary this year allows them to pick up a couple of hockey contracts. People say that Terry Pegula doesn't want to pay people to not coach and to not GM for him, but he just picked up about $18.5 million that he doesn't have to spend on the football side.
Yeah, I think it's less about the money and more about the contracts and the extensions and the dates on them. The fact that the extensions that they gave to Kevin Adams and Don Granato wouldn't actually be kicking in until this offseason. So you'd be firing these guys before the extensions that you gave them actually go into effect, and that would look, stupid to do, or, maybe look like you were foolish in the past for making those commitments. And I just think that ownership is more detached from this franchise than it was in previous times when they made coach and management changes, and they want to believe that they have the right management structure in place. And there are some signs that this is going in the right direction. This team didn't really fall apart. It's still been competitive in many of these losses in the second half of the season, has a lot of young talent. And this could just be part of the growing pains, as much as people are sick of hearing about that. And maybe because in the NHL, you do need new blood on the bench and in the coaching staff often. That could be a justification to make a coaching change. But I'm not so sure that the coach and the general manager, I'm not so sure that the coach held this team back this year, and I'm not so sure that the general manager isn't doing the right things, playing the long game. But as I said on this podcast a couple weeks ago, The Sabres need a new GM and they need a new coach. It doesn't necessarily mean it can't be Kevin Adams and it can't be Don Granato. They just need those two to change their style and behave a bit differently in this offseason and going into next season to get different results, because they can't have the same offseason strategy and the same coaching systems and styles and everything be the same next year. I don't think they'll get the results that they want. They need something new and different from whoever is in place, even if it's the same people.
Also change in place, the Canisius men's basketball program, Jonah, before we wrap up this portion of Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and business consultants. Your thoughts on Canisius and their move?
Well, they got a great MAC coach. Turns out it was the other MAC, but, especially back when Jim Christian coached at Kent State, the Mid-American Conference was noticeably stronger than the Metro Atlantic Conference, and probably still is a better league, even though they've maybe gotten closer in times like that. But Jim Christian is the all-time winningest by percentage MAC coach, won 70% of his games coaching at Kent State and Ohio, never had fewer than 20 wins in a season, and did well enough at both of those jobs that he ended up getting, moving up to TCU from Kent State and moving up to Boston College from his time at Ohio. So that blend of experience and having won at a similar mid-major level seems like Canisius got somebody with a pedigree and good potential to lift this program from the bottom of the MAC to being more competitive. There's challenges in place. Canisius is always going to have one of the lowest budgets in the MAC, and with the way their gym is, the size of their gym and their facilities, it's a difficult place to win. But Jim Christian has proven that he can win elsewhere at the mid-major level, even if he didn't do quite as well at Boston College or TCU. And I think if you're a Canisius fan or a Canisius supporter, there is reason to be optimistic that they found a good coach that is going to, inject a bit of life into this program, even though he's not a young, energetic figure that maybe some people thought that they needed, especially after having, experienced coaches in Reggie Witherspoon and Jim Barron the last two times. But I think you got to give Jim Christian some benefit of the doubt that he won at Kent State and he won at Ohio, and should be able to win at Canisius if he was able to do that in a better league at that time.
8 seasons in the Mid-American Conference for either Kent State or Ohio University. 8 seasons, 5 regular season championships in the Mid-American Conference. Now, he was able to translate that into conference tournament championship and the NCAA tournament only twice, but still pretty impressive at both Kent State and Ohio to do those things. 2-time Mid-American Conference Coach of the Year. And things didn't work out for him at Boston College, but this is the type of coach that I think is a win. I mean, it's not just, to me, looking at his record more than anything. I don't know a ton about him beyond, just knowing what his accolades are and taking a look at his track record. But this is kind of better than you'd expect Canisius to draw in terms of a candidate, right?
Yeah, he's a coach that some people would look at it and say they were surprised he was interested in the job, that he was even a candidate that they were able to get on campus to interview. But having been where he's been and the number of head coaching opportunities that he's had, maybe he can't be as selective about his next job if he still wants to be a Division I head coach. He had been an assistant at Kent State the past 2 years, and they had done pretty well, especially 2 years ago, did very well. And if he wants to still be a head coach, he can't turn up his nose at a school like Canisius. And, I think that I don't want to say, because I don't know if it's necessarily going to work out, especially on the recruiting and the NIL front. But he recruited a lot of talented players at Kent State, especially from the junior college level. And those things make a difference, having those connections. He has a New England background, and New England has the best prep schools in the country, and that's very important for recruiting at this level. I just really believe that he has the blueprint for getting a good roster and winning at this level, and whether it works out or not. And he's proven that he can coach. He's not somebody that doesn't know what he's doing. He knows how to win at Canisius, and seems like he knows what to do and how to apply that to winning in this league. And a similar thing happened in the MAC last year with Tom Pecora at Quinnipiac, and he had been very experienced at Fordham and Hofstra and had some success in the past, but not so successful more recently at those jobs. And then came into Quinnipiac. And I think some people weren't so sure about that hire, thought he was a retread and on the way out and on the way down. And
a retread,
whatever. He won the league, at least regular season wise. And I think maybe that's something that Canisius athletic director Bill Maher looked at, that Jim Christian could be similar to, what Quinnipiac got out of Tom Pecora.
Jonah, thanks for this. I know you can't stick around for Travis Yost, but anything you want to add before you have to split?
No, I'm just on my way over to the Northtown Center, and the International Deaf Hockey Series is going to be in Amherst for the next couple of days, and there's a bit of an opening ceremony tonight with Pat Coletta, and I believe some of the teams are representatives of some of the teams in the countries that are in town to play that. So that's what I'll be doing tonight, and keeping an eye on this weekend. Oh, there's Sabres games. Canisius introducing Jim Christian, a Bandits regular season game that they can clinch their playoff spot this weekend. And then, Bill's season begins anew a week from now, in a way.
Let's not forget Fan Appreciation Night for the Sabres tomorrow night against the Washington Capitals. Your final chance to see the 2023-24 Buffalo Sabres.
Well, do we think we'll see a fan revolt's too strong a word, but we've seen fan appreciation nights where the fans showed their disappreciation with the team, use that event to do that. I think we could see some of that tomorrow, but I don't know. What do you think?
I feel like they've had the opportunity to do that for the last month, and I think apathy is too thick, it seems to me. I'm surprised, that Fire Donnie chant that was so newsworthy back in December, we haven't really heard much of that for the remainder of the season. The players got pissy about it and wouldn't salute the fans, and they took offense, but fans haven't come back around to that too much. I don't know.
There was a little bit of that in.
You were in the arena more than I am. Do you feeling anything what's the temperature?
Well, it depends on how the game is going. But yeah, I think that there's been that feeling in the arena when the Sabres have fallen behind in the first period at home. They've either won the games or they've come back in some of these games where they had bad starts lately, that there haven't been too many stinkers at home of late. But there was one about 2 weeks ago. I'm trying to think. It was early on in this homestand, and there was a bit of those Fire Donnie chants. Now, it wasn't as loud, and I think the game didn't go quite in that direction where it got as bad as it did the first time. But you did hear some of this. But the Sabres, for the most part, I think have been too good in the second half of the season for there to be a large groundswell of fire the coach sentiment, even though I hear it from people I know and kind of, just people that I interact with just about every time they lose. That seems to be the knee-jerk reaction to blame Don Granato. And I don't believe that Don Granato should have been fired at any point during the season, that the coaching change would have made a difference or that he was the reason they were losing. But I also think it's very fair at the end of the season to kind of evaluate what did and didn't happen this year and maybe go in a different direction. But I don't think, I even heard it today. The Sabres canceled practice this morning, and I believe that was largely planned ahead of time, that with the travel and the games not being meaningful anymore, that they wouldn't practice today. But some people asked me if that was some sort of indication about the future of the coach, and it's not. So I think there's a lot of people that are still looking at it like that coaching change needs to happen any day now. I don't think it will, but I think there's a large segment of the fan base that wants it to happen and is looking for it to happen and anticipating it happening.
All right, Jonah. We'll see what Travis Yost thinks about all that, and we'll see here in the next couple of days. I mean, the season, we still got a few more days in the season. They don't end on Thursday. They still have another game after that, or two.
2 games, Saturday and Monday they play.
Right, before they're finally done. Both of those are road games, though. So maybe this time next week we'll have some more meat on the bone regarding the Sabres and their coach and their general manager. Thanks to everybody out there for listening so far. Stay tuned. Right after this break, we're going to have Travis Yost of TSN.
The financial needs of a business go beyond tax and attest services. That's why CTBK goes beyond accounting services and offers outsourced solutions through their affiliation with CFO Solutions Plus. These additional services allow clients to focus on their operational and long-term strategic goals. Trust CTBK's outsourced solutions to provide cost-effective, value-added financial services tailored to your company's needs. Call CTBK at 716-630-2400. Again, 716-630-2400. Or go to ctbk.com to learn more about CTBK's outsourced solutions.
Welcome back to Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK. Join now on the phone a first-time F of the TGAFs, Travis Yost of TSN, calling in from Salt Lake City, of all places. And the reason I say of all places, it's not that Salt Lake City's unusual, but Salt Lake City's in the news today. Phoenix, perhaps, relocating to Salt Lake. And boy, wouldn't that be nice for you, Travis?
That would. And I'll tell you what, the irony of us knowing each other as acquaintances for 15 years, trying to stand up the podcast for 6 months, and the timing of it working out today, the same day where the Coyotes are almost certainly moving to Salt Lake, as I did 18 months ago, is, I think it redefines coincidence, the word.
Right. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk a little Stefon Diggs. We're going to talk some Sabres in their 13th consecutive season without the playoffs being confirmed. But you're in Salt Lake City. You've been there for about 18 months. You say almost certainly. And I know that there's a lot of little nuance here, government aspect, the Scottsdale mayor. I mean, there's all kinds of things of referendums not passing. But what has you saying today that it's almost certain to happen?
So a few reasons, and I actually would go back. Don't look at all my bets in life because most of them were losers, but probably about 4 or 5 months ago, when the very early days of the NHL whispering, oh, you know, Salt Lake City might be an interesting market, and they've done that for the past couple of years off and on with them and Houston in particular. But like I have to say, and I even said it today, I was in by random chance, I was in Vegas when they took the expansion franchise. And Vegas always felt like an inevitable 5-star slam dunk expansion for whichever league got there first. I think frequently people thought it would be the NBA, and it turned out to be the NHL. And boy, has that been one of the best moves the NHL has made in probably the last 2 decades. And I think a lot of the reason, there's a multitude of reasons of why it's working, quote unquote, in Vegas. But one of the many reasons is that city has exploded both in population and economically, and you're seeing it bleed really everywhere in a good way. I see the exact same thing in Salt Lake, and in fact, I have compared Salt Lake now to where Vegas was about 10 years ago when I first started spending a lot of time there. For the same reasons, it is one of the most economically booming West Coast cities. It is massively assimilated, which I think is something that whether the NHL weighs or not, I don't know that this relocation or expansion gambit would have worked in 20 years ago in Salt Lake. It would have been a much smaller city, a very tiny TV market, extremely regional, extremely religious. There's challenges navigating that. The Jazz dealt with that in the 90s and early 2000s. You come here now and Salt Lake County feels kind of like Vegas or Denver. I mean, that's exactly what it feels like. And I do think the fact that they've got a ready arena that can sit close to 14,000 people at the Delta Center where the Jazz currently are, coupled with a massive and ongoing, notably ongoing, not speculative, ongoing development, multi-billion-dollar development project in Salt Lake County where the Jazz were already sniffing around for their next arena, it seems almost inevitable, not just that the Coyotes are going to move to Salt Lake, but I do think it's going to be part of a multi-series, a multi-year gambit where the Jazz are then going to, the Jazz ownership are then going to have a dual tenant arena with 82 home games across an NBA and NHL team in a growing city. And it just seems to check so many of the boxes that the NHL looks for in a partner. And most pertinent to this discussion is it's pretty seamless to bail the Coyotes out. And as promising as the Salt Lake market is, I think on the other side of that coin, it has been absolute DEFCON 1 in Arizona for 2 decades. And it's always felt like, is this really going to happen? And even this latest land auction that's coming around the corner, I mean, you read some of the pieces that were filed today, it doesn't even sound like the NHL is going to wait for the auction, which tells you everything that you need to know about the prospect, in my opinion, of the Coyotes staying there. And I'll end on this and why I feel so confident that this is going to happen. It's just a question of, is it for immediately for next season or 1 year after? I do think when it dropped this morning, and I think Frank Saravelli had it, that they were creating dual schedules. You have been around the NHL long enough to know that sort of stuff. That's not a hedge. That's not protection. That's planning. And to me, the league is increasingly bearish on the Coyotes and the Phoenix as a market. And when Bill Daly came out, when I think jointly when the Players Association released that statement a few months ago about how ridiculous playing in a 4,000 go Sun Devils, by the way, a 4,000 seat arena in Phoenix would be for 3 more years. I thought that was when the writing was on the proverbial wall, and now we're just in the execution phase at this point.
Was there a death blow? What will we look back on with Arizona and see, all right, that was it. That was the point of no return. That was their last gasp chance to make it work.
Man, I mean, you've probably read Field of Schemes. I mean, that story could be longer than War and Peace. I do think, though, there's merit to the point people have raised, though. They didn't have a real full-term, long-term arena plan when the Coyotes were first planted in Arizona. And I think ever since that point in time, whether the market was great or terrible or all points in between, across the Jim Balsillie era and all this series of ownership failures, they've never been able to figure out the arena problem, and it's been a problem since effectively day one. And even when the Coyotes were, I'll say, relatively humming, I was there. I did my undergrad at Arizona State, and like getting to a Coyotes game was like traveling across the country. I mean, it was up in Glendale. It was so far removed from everything societally in Phoenix proper and Tempe proper, where so much of your population base was. You couple that with poor ownership, poor strategic planning, no long-term commitment jointly with the city or the municipalities. And just, again, and it's like, you know, they, I think, and I do give I am known to kill the NHL, and I think rightfully so in most cases. It's why I give the NHL a lot more credit than probably many do for the Vegas expansion. It would have been so easy to say hockey is not working in these southern markets. Especially these Southwest markets, and Phoenix is just a great example of that. Now, you know, you could have counterpointed that with, well, Nashville's been a success and Carolina's been a success, but I think Vegas and Phoenix are fundamentally different cities than those two. And full credit to the NHL. When they went into Vegas, I actually thought that was kind of an indication of them acknowledging, right, wrong, or otherwise, the problems in Phoenix were generally tied to government and ownership, and not the NHL's inherent business or growth plan. So credit to them for staying bullish in some of these markets, especially these big TV markets. But if you give the NHL credit for all of that, you also have to kind of slap them on the wrist for really, I think, babying this process for maybe 10 years too long at this point. I mean, this has been going on for close to 2 decades. And to your point about when that apex was, I mean, I go back to literally day one of when the Coyotes went there, but I do think you can say when that Tempe deal dried up, that was the death knell, because ever since then, and that was going back a few years now, but ever since then, it felt like total scramble mode to find any side of a home, and it's just not working there.
The Coyotes, as putrid as the organization has been, have been to the postseason since the Buffalo Sabres have been last to the postseason. 13 straight seasons now confirmed as of last night. Before we get into the problems, Travis, let me ask you, what has you excited when it comes to the Buffalo Sabres?
So some Sabres fans will kill me for this, and I don't blame them one iota, because as a Bills fan, I lived through that drought. And at some point you get to a point where it's like, just let me know when they get to the playoffs. I don't care about your platitudes and your glass half full approach. I do think it's really important to differentiate the Sabres teams of the last, let's say, 2 seasons from the, 13-year or the 11 years previous drought era Sabres, because these teams have been competitive. Like, if you look at the Sabres right now, they are a competitive hockey team. They have a chance to finish with 85 points in the season. I know that's not great. It's certainly not going to be enough for the playoffs, but they have been competitive most of the year. And what has really eroded them in the last year and a half, 2 seasons, and I know Luukkonen's been a nice upside surprise really in the last few months, but the goaltending has been so heinous and so horrific that it's been very, very hard to see the real on-ice growth at the skater level. And I will draw a direct line, go back about 5-6 years ago, and yes, maybe the floor was a little higher, but the Carolina Hurricanes were mired in a very similar situation where I still distinctly remember getting killed on Canadian radio twice right around the trade deadline, maybe it was either 5 or 6 seasons ago, where I was making the argument that Carolina was starting to show the signs of a really, really promising hockey team. And if you remove the nets from the ice and just watch the territorial flow of the game, the Hurricanes would look like a top 5 team. You put the nets back on the ice and it's like, oh yeah, they just give up goals like crazy. That's a long-winded way of saying they have a serious goaltending problem. I know the Sabres are hopeful, and probably increasingly hopeful from this season, that Luukkonen can be the answer to their problem. But like, if you look across the lineup at some of their best players, even this season, most of these guys are getting 88, 89% on-ice save percentage. I mean, it's just very, very hard to win in this league, even in the elevated scoring era. But I do think that the skating talent, especially on the blue line, but even notably within their top 6, it is remarkably better than where it was even a few years ago. And the skeptic and the cynic is just never going to want to hear that, because it's still a drought. It's still a mediocre team. My counterpoint is mediocrity is not subpar, and it's certainly not bad. And there are signs of life within this organization that I can literally go down a list right now of teams, Columbus, San Jose, Anaheim, on and on, where there is just either no hope at all, or hope is they're so deep in the early stages of a rebuild that you're talking being years out from being competitive. The last and final point I would make to answer your question, it's still a game of relativity. Look around the division. There's a Boston team that is on the downswing. Finally, for the first time in 25 years, probably one of the most well-run franchises in the sport. The Bruins are not the same team they were 5 years ago. The Senators have not been able to spur their rebuild quick enough. You could argue the Sabres are a little bit ahead. Same argument for the Red Wings. Toronto has not materially improved. I think you could argue that they've taken a step backwards. Tampa Bay has taken a decisive step backwards, a likely wild card team this year. Said another way, the only team that you can look at within the division, shout out Sam Reinhart, that really has moved to the upside is Florida. And if it is a game of relativity, and you're always guaranteed 3 playoff spots in this stupid playoff format, and there's always 2 biddable wild card spots, the Sabres are pretty close. I mean, they're likely going to finish like 4-ish points out of the playoffs. And although that is it's not meant to be, it's not meant to the diehard Sabres fan who's lived through this 13-year and be like, I can't do another season of just meaningless hockey in April. I do think you do have to draw a line or stratify really the decade-long, just horrific, heinous Sabres hockey versus what we've seen in the last couple of years, because it's certainly more entertaining and it's certainly more competitive.
I think that the fans are also in a position where they want a coaching and or management change. We're looking at 2 of the longer tenured coaches and general manager in the NHL. Believe it or not, I think they're in the top 10 and no playoff appearances to speak for it. Where are you on Don Granato and Kevin Adams?
I would look more towards the front office if I were going to make a change, for a variety of reasons. Number one, I think the front offices generally have way more outsized control on the results of a lineup. I know we spend a lot of time talking about coaches and structural philosophy and deployment strategy and whatnot, but usually on a relative basis, they're picking at the margins relative to what a front office can do or can't do. And again, I go back to the original problem. Right, wrong, or otherwise, whether you believe that anyone can predict a goalie's outcome or goalies are total voodoo and it's random chance outcome or all points in between, goaltending has, by and large, has been what sunk this team. And it is very difficult for me to lay that at the feet of Don Granato before I laid that at the feet of the front office, who has had opportunities to make commitments at the position, to upgrade at the position, and they have chosen not to. The wrinkle to that, though, is I could also make an argument that the Sabres front office has at least done a good job bringing in and securing young talent that isn't just like promising from a prospect standpoint where it's like, oh, that guy's going to be great in 3 years. Like, you're actually seeing real on ice results at the NHL level from their younger players, right? And there was a point 2-3 years ago where we were asking, like, so what is Rasmus Dahlin? Like, he's definitely an NHLer and he's definitely capable, but is he great? Is he good? Like, I mean, there were so many questions, and a lot of these guys have developed into quality players. I do give the front office some credit for that, but then you have to ask the question of, like, how much time is too much time? How many years does the front office really need to take? If you look, I did this analysis last summer. Most teams get out of a rebuild within 4 seasons, and that's just inherently cyclical, the cyclical nature of the sport. So when you look at a team that's, 10 plus years in with a very tenured front office that has made mistakes, and if not acquisition mistakes, then non-acquisition mistakes. I killed Ottawa for this, but I can make the same argument about the Sabres. Jake Allen was there, a readily available upgrade for any team in the league. And every discussion about Jake Allen at the trade deadline was, well, what buyers are interested in upgrading a goalie? And it's like, well, why do they have to be a buyer? Like, can't it just be a competitive team that's looking for a goalie with a little bit of term that makes sense for the organization longer term? And honestly, Jake Allen's been fantastic since the trade deadline, right? And that's just one name, it's one example, but it gives you an idea of, like, there have been options for this front office and there have been bullets in the chamber, and they've had the cap and prospect or asset flexibility to make decisive trades, and they've chosen not to. And I think that's the biggest criticism of the Sabres is it may not be so much about who they've acquired, it's rather their acquisition strategy or their non-acquisition strategy. And you could pair that to teams like Vegas and Colorado and Carolina that are so aggressive, militantly aggressive, and quite frankly, ruthless in some cases with how they build their lineups. I get that they're contenders, but they're also contenders for a reason. So I also, some of that is earned and some of that is a byproduct of where they are. You'd like to see, in my opinion, I'd want to see a more aggressive Sabres front office, and I think that's the biggest criticism I have.
Perhaps you're doing this subconsciously, perhaps you're psychic, but your segue game is amazing. Speaking of trades, let's talk about the Buffalo Bills and the trade that they made regarding Stefon Diggs. I'll just ask you, what's your general take on it when it happened, and what the Bills got in return?
So I was surprised that he was traded, but I was only surprised for one reason. And the only reason I was surprised was because of the dead cap and the impact that it would have on a team that is Super Bowl or quasi Super Bowl caliber currently, as is built, with a top 2, top 3 at worst quarterback in the league. And the reason why I say for that one reason only is, and I give you full credit to this, Tim, you were on top of this before many others. There was a clear, if not rift, let's say disconnect. Organizationally, there's just so much weird stuff going on with Diggs over the last 2 years. And I made this point I think the day of the trade or the day after, but Stefan Diggs is an amazing receiver. And I think many of the issues the offense had were unrelated to Diggs. Diggs was absolutely additive in terms of the team's success and performance. The problem is, and I'm laughing because I'm thinking of a name. If you've ever worked with a coworker that's talented, but just a real challenge to work with, a real pain in the ass, someone where you get in your car and you're like, can't believe I got to meet with that guy today. Like, even if they're talented, even if they're bright, even if they have real defined character traits, in my professional experience, again, industry agnostic, that tends to be erosive and a culture negative, and eventually it either drives a rift or a material change. And let's be honest, the organization is committed to Josh Allen forever, right? And basically until he's either injured or he retires or something insane happens. But that is a marriage. That is a full-blown marriage at this point. And there was just way too much noise and chatter around Diggs, coupled with the fact that you do have an aging receiver. You did start to see marginal signs, I think, of slippage in production from him specifically last season. And on top of that, the Bills really do have an opportunity. The door is wide open to their contender status. The reason why I wasn't so aggrieved at the trade, setting aside the cap impact, which is significant and a negative for the Bills, no doubt about it, I do think they're going to be super aggressive at the draft. I really do. Like, I think they are going to turn around and say, look, just because we traded Stefon Diggs and maybe we did it for 70 cents or 60 cents on the dollar is not going to preclude how aggressive we are going to be at the draft. And they've got the capital to seriously move up in the draft. And I think what the way the Bills, whether they have been thinking about it for months or weeks, or they've just gotten to this point, post Diggs trade, I think it's a sigh of relief to some degree that even if they're recognizing that they're going to take a half step backwards, there's a possibility that they could upgrade at the position. That's certainly the case, considering how deep this wide receiver draft is. And more importantly, they were going to have to make a decision on Diggs by next summer in all likelihood. So yes, it accelerated the timing. Yes, it does. It's a half step backwards for this season. But it kind of felt like this was moving in this direction. And I'll end on this. For the flack that the Bills caught over the entire Steph Diggs saga and the eventual trade, I found the reaction to that pretty wild as an outlier in a way where I actually thought there was merit to the deal. What's killing this team is the Von Miller contract. And even at the time when he signed that deal, people were like, well, if they get a Super Bowl, it makes sense. When you're making that argument on behalf of a player, it's already a very uncomfortable argument to make. And when he dries up the way he did, injuries, age, just totally ineffective at this point, that's the contract.
An arrest.
That's the decision that's killing this team.
An arrest. Also, that's still looming. We don't know what's going to come of that, but
that's what's killing the team. And that to me is a 5-to-1, 5-to-1 on the magnitude scale relative to a Stefon Diggs trade. It might even be higher than that.
Yeah, I agree with that. During the break, as we were recording segments, my co-host Jonah Bronstein and I were talking about Stefan Diggs, and we came around in the discussion to, hey, have you seen any of his teammates say, hey, we're going to miss you, or loved playing with you, or man, the business sucks sometimes. And in the meantime, in between Jonah and I doing our segment and this segment, Travis, I went looking for him. I found Dion Dawkins tweet something out, or it was on one of the social media sites that essentially said, hey, see you down the road. And that's it. That's all I could find. So that, I think, lends itself to what you were saying. There is a relief within the organization, and there is, again, you were way more articulate in explaining what addition by subtraction means, using words like erosive and counterculture. You didn't say counterculture, but that's true. It's absolutely true. I think we're seeing it now. I think people are finally able to reflect on Stefan Diggs and say what they really feel, because everybody was afraid of upsetting him.
I'll bow and ribbon it with this point. When people lose leaders, especially in sports, I would say it's outsized in sports, they'll say it. They'll say this is a cultural hit. Tim, you and I, for how many years have we been covering sports in some way, shape, or form? Culture is like almost exhaustively, to some degree, comically talked about, overstated to the nth degree. We know.
Sean McDermott cried at the thought of losing all those captains when he was asked about it. He was having trouble speaking, and now they pulled the trigger on Stefan Diggs.
leadership matters, and you go to the point about checking tweets and seeing what people say. I bet even around, whether it was the Vikings trade or the Bills trade for that matter, and it sounds like you found very little, but even people adjacent to the team, if anyone gave, Diggs his flowers on the way out, and they should have, he was a great Bill, brilliant player, talented player, unguardable player, but you didn't hear leader, and that to me, you can lead by actions, you can lead by words, but when you are not a positive on culture, and that no one talks about culture more than the Buffalo Bills in the NFL, it's top 3 at worst. I do think that is a bit of a damning non-statement made by the rest of the team and organization.
Travis, I can't thank you enough for doing this and making time on a busy day in which you're excitedly getting ready to buy your season tickets for the Salt Lake Coyotes. I guess you wouldn't be buying season. Would you be a season ticket holder? I mean, you're in the media.
I'm running out of teams here. I'm watching the Senators, Sabres, Knights. I got the Coyotes. I got too many teams covered. I still hate the. What's funny is I grew up on Long Island, spent my whole life on Long Island, and I hate the New York Islanders. I can say that safely on this podcast. So I get screamed at by Islanders fans, but I'm deep across the NHL. I got a team in every division at this point.
Well, I appreciate your time, Travis. It means a lot to me that you come on the podcast. I'm grateful for your first appearance here. Hopefully we can have you back.
Anytime, Tim. You got it.
All right. And thanks to everybody out there for listening to Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK CPAs and Business Consultants.